our deep sorrow and sympathy to Tamie Fraser and their children, Angela and Phoebe and Hugh and Mark, on the loss of their husband and father. And I know how close they were as a family, and the loss would be very, very intense, and I do express my sympathy to them. Malcolm Fraser was, of course, Prime Minister of Australia between December of 1975 and March of 1983. And he is the fourth longest serving Prime Minister of Australia. In political terms, he achieved the significant feat of winning 3 elections. He dominated the political scene on the centre-right side of politics from the time he assumed the leadership of the Liberal Party in March of 1975. Throughout his time as Leader of the Opposition, which was brief, and then the 7.5 odd years as Prime Minister, he maintained a very close association and coalition with Doug Anthony, the leader of the National Party. And the intimacy of that coalition and the strength of it was one of the things that underpinned the success of his government. And it's significant that the success of Liberal-led governments in Australia since the party was founded in 1944 has always depended crucially on maintaining a very close association and coalition with the members of the National Party. That was the case with the Menzies government, as it was with the Fraser government and with the Howard government. It's fair at a time like this to make an observation about Fraser's prime ministership at the time of his relinquishing that position in March of 1983. And in his book, The Hawke Ascendancy, Paul Kelly, who has, by most measures, become a very significant chronicler of Australian political events, had this to say: Fraser was a very good Prime Minister, much better than people would have suspected in 1975. He ran a government of above average competence by Australian standards, with acumen, dedication and professionalism. I, of course, had a very close association with Malcolm Fraser, both in the few months of opposition and then the 7.5 years of government. He showed extraordinary strength in holding the coalition together after the decision was taken in October of 1975 to defer in the Senate the granting of supply to the Whitlam Government for its budget of that year. Millions of words, numerous books and countless speeches have been written or made about the events leading to the dismissal of the Whitlam Government. The only 2 points I would add is to pay tribute to the remarkable strength and capacity Malcolm Fraser displayed in holding the coalition together, and in the process of doing that to make the point that the decision to defer supply was not a decision rammed down the throats of a quavering and reluctant coalition party room, but was a consequence, amongst other things, of Malcolm Fraser consulting every member of his shadow ministry and all of them raising their hands in favour of the deferral of supply. The other observation I'd make for those who continue to dispute the wisdom of what Malcolm Fraser did is to remind people that in 1975 and 1977 he won 2 emphatic majorities. In 1975, the biggest majority in Australian electoral history, and that was almost matched by his re-election in the end of 1977. In government, he restored order and tranquillity to the affairs of government in the nation. The last 12 months of the Whitlam government, even in the eyes of those who revere Gough Whitlam, were months of chaos and confusion and disorder. and there was a sense of stability and calm and reassurance restored to the nation's affairs. And in those early years, the level of inflation was pulled back, jobs were created, and there were significant restraints put upon the growth of federal government spending. Malcolm Fraser was a very dedicated federalist, and in that sense he was very true to the traditions of the Liberal Party. His decision to give back to the states control over seas and submerged lands, despite a decision by the High Court to the effect that the Commonwealth enjoyed that power, was an illustration. His new federalism policy, which offered to the states the capacity to cut income tax levied by the Commonwealth by 5% within their individual states, or to add a 5% surcharge, was a very radical commitment to giving the states more authority. And it's significant, of course, to note that not one single state government was willing to take up that offer, and it languished through lack of interest, not on the part of the Commonwealth Government or of the Prime Minister, but rather on the part of the states. And it is worth in debate that continues on rearranging our taxation system to bear that in mind. And finally, of course, on the Franklin Dam issue, Malcolm Fraser, in his heart, did not favour the damming of the Franklin, but his federalist principles could not bring him to support the use of the External Affairs power to block it. So he made a very generous financial offer to the Tasmanian government of, I think, $400 million, but the offer was rejected. A change of government occurred, and the incoming Hawke government blocked the damming of the Franklin. He will also be remembered by many people for the generosity of his response after the end of the war in Vietnam to Indo-Chinese refugees, taking many tens of thousands of them, the Fraser government did, from refugee camps in the region. And in part, that made up for the quite shameful treatment, in my view, of many Vietnamese people who had been closely associated with the Australian effort in Vietnam in the dying months of that war by the Whitlam government. And in some way, what Fraser did in that respect made up for what I regarded as a lamentable failure of the Whitlam government on that front. He was, as everyone knows, a staunch and unrelenting opponent of apartheid. He involved himself in the affairs of Africa probably more than any Australian Prime Minister before or since. And he was certainly well known and well remembered for that. Can I just say something about my own personal relations with him? Malcolm Fraser was somebody that I was attracted to in the early 1970s because I thought he put the case for Australia's commitment in Vietnam rather better than most of his other colleagues. And when I entered Parliament in 1974, I saw him as a future leader of the Liberal Party. I supported him in both of his leadership bids, in culminating, of course, in his becoming leader in 1975. He was very generous to me in promoting me very early, in giving me the opportunity in politics. I always valued that and was always grateful for it. We worked together very closely, particularly when I became Treasurer at the end of 1977, and remained in very close professional harmony and cooperation until the defeat of his government in March of 1983. There were policy issues on which we disagreed, and one in particular, of course, was the introduction of a broad-based indirect tax, something that was long overdue even then, and became even longer in it being overdue as the years were to go by, but was finally brought about in the year 2000. We also disagreed regarding some aspects of the deregulation of the financial system, and I won't pretend that after we left government we didn't have areas of disagreement, and he was critical of some of the policies of my government, I acknowledge that. That was his right, and the public will make its own judgment about the validity of different points of view taken. But it's fair to say that last year I had the opportunity of 2 discussions with him. I interviewed him in relation to the compilation of my book on Menzies, and they were discussions that I enjoyed, and I'm sure he did, and it was an opportunity to talk about somebody who meant a great deal to both of us, the founder of the party that both Malcolm Fraser and I had the privilege of leading. Anybody who achieves what Malcolm Fraser achieved in his life deserves respect as a quite extraordinary Australian. He brought to the government of this country, he brought great integrity. As a chairman of cabinet, he had a fearsome knowledge of any submission that came across the cabinet table, and pity help any minister who hadn't sufficiently read the submission that had been prepared for him or her by the respective department. I found him a very effective chairman of cabinet. Perhaps we probably had one or too many cabinet meetings. He liked meetings, but he was certainly somebody who was remarkably well briefed. He projected a clear image of Australian nationalism on the international stage, and people knew where he stood on issues. They didn't always agree with him, particularly in some of the stances he took in relation to, say, Zimbabwe and other affairs involving Africa, but they had a very clear view of what he of where he stood. He placed extraordinary emphasis, as have other Prime Ministers, on Australia's relations with China, whilst at the same time in no way neglecting to keep our relations with Japan and other nations in Asia in very good repair. So, ladies and gentlemen, in recording my sorrow and sympathy to his family, I thank him for his service to the Liberal Party of Australia. He brought that party from opposition back into government in less than 3 years. He delivered 3 election victories, which by any measure is a very significant achievement. And he applied himself to the position of Prime Minister with very great dedication and very great professionalism and skill.